Hello everyone, it's 2 minutes past 10, so I think we'll make a start if that's okay, and if we have any latecomers, hopefully they will trickle in the next minute or so. Good morning everybody, my name is Ellen Goodwin. I am Infrastructure Manager and Clean Growth Lead at New Anglia Local Enterprise Partnership. Today I'm representing the Norfolk Climate Change Partnership. I was going to say that was fun. I've never had that before. Anyway, I'm going to carry on. Apologies for that. I'm not sure what happened, so I'm going to start where I left off, and hopefully it's a little glitch that we can not re-experience. Like I say, today I'm representing the Norfolk Climate Change Partnership, and we are delighted to be working with Net Zero East on this UK government's community renewal funded project, Community Energy Kickstarter. Andy will give you a precise definition of community energy shortly, but for me, this is all about community conception, delivery and ownership, looking to deliver net zero benefits for a locality in the broadest possible sense. Community energy is something that has not been hugely popular in Norfolk to date, which is precisely why the Climate Change Partnership has commissioned Net Zero East to see how we might spark more interest in it across the county. Before we start, I just wanted to say that the webinar is being recorded today to help shape the ongoing work of the project. If you have any particular concerns about this, can you contact Neve directly, please? Neve, are you happy just to drop your email address in the chat, just in case anybody has any? Much done. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Andy, who is General Manager at Net Zero East, who is going to be leading today's seminar. Apologies for hearing me thousands of times. Thank you very much.
Cheers, thank you, Ellen, and hopefully as we can solve that glitch before Nigel comes on to present his bit. So yes, good morning everybody, Andy Holyland. Today we're going to take you through the Community Energy Kickstarter project, providing an overview of our project direction and the approach that we'll take to providing benefit and additional value across this whole subject around community-based action. We will be taking some sort of controlled pauses where we'll have some questions for people to consider and provide responses. Although there's a lot of information for us to get through, we do want to promote a sort of an interactive session with plenty of engagement. So as well as considering the questions that we pose, the team are on hand to control the chat and the Q&A. So any other questions that come in, please do keep firing them in. We will get to those and we'll address them throughout the presentation. Next slide, please, Nick. So as Ella mentioned, this is part of the project's being delivered on behalf of the NCCP, but it is part of the Community Renewal Fund project. Community Renewal Fund is a UK government programme. It aims to support people and communities most in need across the UK to pilot programmes and new approaches to prepare for the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, as well as other funds and initiatives that are on the horizon. And hopefully through this project, we'll start to identify which are going to be the most suitable for different types of projects that are identified. CRF invests in revenue schemes to support skills, community and place, local businesses and supporting people in employment. Just by way of an update, so far there's been 225 projects awarded, totaling 125 million. And as you can see there, Norfolk have been awarded 14 projects with a total award of 6.7 million. So reiterating the point that Ella made, we've not been overly successful and had a number of challenges to actually gaining some traction in this area. And obviously this project is hopefully going to provide some clarity, guidance and opportunity to kickstart that movement. Next slide, please, Neve. So as we mentioned, we're delivering this on behalf of the Norfolk Climate Change Partnership. So just by way of an update of that group, it was established in January 2020. Partnership's aim is to develop Norfolk into an exemplar in tackling climate change and enhancing its natural environment. The NCCP will share knowledge and practices regarding how local authorities can respond to climate change, as well as how Norfolk Climate Change Partnership can influence climate change across the whole of Norfolk. It has a shared interest in supporting Norfolk's authorities, communities, public, voluntary and community organisations, businesses and residents to reduce their carbon emissions. It will realise economic benefits of reducing consumption and adapt to the mitigation of future impacts of climate change. The Norfolk Climate Change Partnership are built up of representatives from across all 7 districts, as well as representatives from the Broads Authority. And we do, as part of this project, have a steering group where we sort of liaise with on a weekly basis to ensure we're on track with our project deliverables. We're also discussing our evolving programme and making sure we're taking the thoughts and input from all of those key stakeholders. Next slide, please. So under this CRF funded scheme, and also as part of the sort of wider Net Zero Norfolk programme, there were 2 projects that were awarded under this strand. There was Lot 1, the Sustainable Hydrogen for Transport Infrastructure project, which is being delivered separately by Ricardo. And then there's the Lot 2 project, which is this Community Energy Kickstarter project, which is being delivered by Net Zero East and supported by project partner Arup. And we'll cover more details on who's doing what shortly. The Lot 1 and Lot 2 projects, there is obviously a requirement to engage, and we are having discussions across the 2 projects with Ricardo and ourselves to ensure there is some synergy and some collaborative approach to the work we're doing. And this will further be sort of consolidated in a project that we're calling Lot 2B, but is essentially a Norfolk Net Zero Decarbonisation Pathfinder. And that really is to provide the direction and travel, governance and structure for proposed next actions based on the findings of the 2 feasibility studies around Lot 1 and Lot 2. We will discuss the Lot 2B project later on in the presentation, as that has a slightly different end date due to having to compile the information across both projects. Next slide, please, Neve. Perfect. So I will hand over to my colleague Nigel Cornwall, and fingers crossed you don't get to hear my voice on repeat again.
And mine, bad enough, once, never mind 6 times. Good morning, everybody. Thanks, Andy and team. I'm just going to, as an aside, really say a little bit about what we mean by community energy. Many of you operating in the sector will know that there are multiple and different uses of the term, and had we been talking about community energy 5-10 years ago, there would have been very much a very specific focus on local generation schemes, which is where most of the activity was. And in fact, our original prompt in the ITT was around looking at behind the meter solar generation and how that might develop around what's called private wires, i.e. where generation is moved to a consumer, with most of the power flows occurring behind the meter without power moving onto the public system. So that is one element of what we'll be looking at, but I think we have also identified an opportunity to, if you like, provide a more contemporary view of what's happening in the marketplace, which is much more aligned with the wider government decarbonisation programmes, and in particular the adoption of the net zero target, which was legislated for in June 2019. And what has become clear over the past 4 or 5 years in particular is that what used to be a focus around generation schemes supported by predictable revenue flows and subsidies and a guaranteed what we will call in the industry route to market, i.e. guaranteed access to the customer, has turned into a much more wide-ranging debate. And that's worked in 2 ways. The first is that we now are no less focused on what happens behind the customer's meter, how the customer uses meter, uses power and energy, how it can make decisions, utilize smart meters, control technology, and make the best choices for that particular customer. So very much a focus on use as well as production at the local level. And also there's been, particularly since 2018, a lot of interest around what we call in the industry smart local energy systems. And these are innovation projects that are being funded by government under the so-called Prospering from the Energy Revolution programme, which is a £100 million programme based on a series of demonstration projects and detailed design schemes, none of which unfortunately are in Norfolk, but which are looking at how more autonomous, resilient relationships can be developed at the local level that meet the needs of the people involved in those communities. And that seems to us to be a very beneficial and supportive development in how people are seeing community energy as a concept. And of course, since 2017, the government's always also been focusing on transport issue. Transport uses energy, and as we will see shortly, transport is a particular issue in terms of emissions, generally in Norfolk, but in some districts in particular. And a range of solutions are being developed at the local level around active transport, car sharing, technology transfer, different alternative fuel developments, which could also be embraced under the definition, and we're choosing to include that as well. So I think we're trying to develop a much more holistic interpretation of what the opportunities are for community-based action around energy in all its forms, including generation, but taking today's interpretation and policy considerations and seeing what opportunities we can identify at the local level. Next slide, please, Neve. So really, the first point's been made, but I think one observation I would make is there is no shortage of literature around community energy, but a lot of it is what I would call theoretical rather than practical. It's about proving concept, particularly on the smart local energy systems. It is not practical in the sense of providing clear orientation material for local stakeholders who want to do something about it. And we think ultimately the success of our feasibility study will be measured in terms of how many people read the document, and more importantly, as important, how many communities actually start thinking about their own bespoke strategies for achieving decarbonisation action at the community level. Fine to say that we're actually starting, however, from a very low point. I know Joanna is going to talk a little bit about the history of development of community energy in Great Britain later, compared with other markets such as Denmark, Germany, Netherlands, community energy is not well represented in Britain. We have seen a very positive upswing in local developments, particularly stimulated by feed-in tariffs and the renewable heat incentive. But still, we are in a relatively poor place relative to other markets. And within that wider context of the national landscape, for reasons that I've always found very hard to pinpoint, development here in East Anglia generally, but also Norfolk in particular, has been very, very slow. Those of you familiar with the maps that are produced by Community Energy England will see lots of groupings around the country. There are some areas that are less well represented, but there is very little activity that they have picked up in this part of the world. So not only is Britain starting from a low point, but East Anglia has particular challenges which we're going to need to unpack to understand, so that we can identify proportionate and sensible solutions that work for communities in East Anglia. I've already talked about the wider definition that we're taking. That should certainly help us build traction at the local level, see what works where, a very important theme within our work. And we're beginning to address these issues at, to put it mildly, a very interesting time. All of you will know the extent to which domestic energy bills and business energy bills have increased over the past 24, 30 months. At the beginning of that period, we used to talk about typical bills for the typical householder of about £1,000 a year for gas and electricity. That figure under the regulated price cap administered by Ofgem is now up at £2,000, and there is the very strong probability that that figure will increase by a further £800 in October. So we have seen an exponential rise in energy prices. Perversely, that means there's opportunity, because the value of energy produced behind the meter, not necessarily locally, but behind the meter, has increased considerably. So technologies which no longer have subsidies, like domestic PV, batteries, are moving back to being a very economic choice. So that means there is opportunity if people can understand the pathways for doing that. And part of our work will be to understand what the local prospects for earlier deployment are in those areas. So that's really the context of the study. What are the cost-effective local solutions that work best here, and how can we support the process through our analysis of publicising those options and signposting the information that people need to make decisions that will ultimately support the net zero pathway. Next slide, please, Neve. And because of, hopefully you will see from this that we've tried to adopt a very thoughtful view of how we can deliver a good study for the region. And that has, in effect, taken us outside, not outside, but it's led us to have a different interpretation, a broader application of the terms of reference that is taking us in a number of different directions. The first is, and it's a term we will use again and again and again, this is the place-specific, people-centric concept of community energy development. Very important to us. There are a number of variables there. Location obviously has a very strong effect on access to resource availability, what the demand construction is like, but there are also other local elements like what people want, what communities are prepared to support, and we are proposing to focus on that, and the local factors that vary between one place and another. We'll come back to that later. We also need to understand how our work fits with other work that's recently been done or is programmed. Many of you will be familiar with the work of the Energy System Catapult and the Local Area Energy Planning document that they issued in September 21. There are in fact a whole range of data sources out there which the team have been very diligently pulling together to try and see what the best inputs are to our studying. Obviously, the local area energy planning in the main uses standard BASE data. We of course are using that, but there are other sources too, including various different techniques of producing territorial and individual consumer carbon footprints. We're assimilating all that. There's a lot more physical data that's made available by network companies, particularly UK Power Network with its distribution future energy scenarios, which looks at deployment of the local system going out almost 30 years ahead. We're not looking 30 years ahead, but we are looking at what they're saying about trends in 25 and 2030. And a further issue that we need to take on board, because it's required in our terms of reference, is this reference to a not-for-profit energy system. Often community energy goes very much hand in hand with the concept of community benefit societies and community benefits. And that basically means that where you do generate a surplus, the monies, which might be on producing electricity generation, the money is, the surpluses are reinvested in maybe demand side schemes, improved usage information for consumers, advice on fuel poverty support, and we think that's a very important element, particularly given my remarks about where prices are heading this winter, and where they already are at. So we've called this enhanced terms of reference. We've agreed it with our oversight group, with NCCP, but we're trying to use our skills, knowledge and the data we can access in a way that produces the best insights for the Norfolk Climate Change Partnership and its membership. Moving on, Neve. That's that's all the aspiration. At the same time, we don't have a blank sheet of paper. One of the points that we have repeatedly made, and I've been quite involved in some of the work that's been done by Power for People around a local electricity bill, is that if you take today's baseline, which we've got to take, there really isn't much scope for local supply, which is why I think our original terms of reference talked about private wires and behind the meter. But basically, what we have in GB is a one-size-fits-all market dominated by national suppliers. 3 years ago, there used to be a lot more suppliers in the market. Many have failed. Many that are left are not actually looking to recruit new customers because of where wholesale prices are at. But nevertheless, the market is still a very national one. If I want to sell, if I've got a solar panel and want to sell to somebody across the road, provided I go across the public network, strictly I have to become a licensed supplier. That is a very expensive business, very complicated business. There are exemptions. There is a carve out, the license like supply regime, but they are very much the exception and not the rule. So we're going to have to work within the existing legal and regulatory framework, but at the same time we have to provide answers that people can use to guide them in their decision-making processes. Who will or can buy my power? How can I access customers without becoming a licensed supplier? What are the risks? If and when is the regime going to change? How do I fund my idea, my generation scheme, without feed-in tariff revenues? These are all very important issues, and we've got, as you will see from the structure of the report, we are trying to provide technical answers to those questions, but to give those answers relevance, we're also trying to pull in as many relevant case studies that we can find of why things work in certain places. That's a bit difficult because many schemes that have been coming onto the system, generation schemes, heat schemes, have benefited under the feed-in tariff regime and the renewable heat incentive. They are no longer with us. So we have to look at the funding, how green finance is developing. It's a broad task, but a very interesting task, which we have now hardwired into our work programme. And finally, excuse me, finally, we need to, again, anchor our work, which Andy's going to talk about in a little bit more detail in a moment, in reality. What do I mean by that? Well, it's pointless coming up with extravagant local development schemes if there isn't connection capacity to allow it to flow onto the system, irrespective of the commercial context that I described earlier. So we are making sure that we understand what developments are occurring within UK power networks. They are working very actively with councils and regional stakeholders to support net zero action, but the regulatory rules, it's a little bit like the wider legal baseline, doesn't really permit that today. However, important changes are coming in 2023 that will change the costs and the risks for those involved. And again, we need to keep that practical question in front of us as we go through our work. So that's all I've got to say for the time being. Back to Andy.
Perfect. Thanks, Nigel. I did publish these questions in the Q&A box just for people to get a sort of a forward sight of what they were, to give them some consideration. So we have got some questions in the chat, which I'll come to in just a second, but just if everyone could just give a thought to those questions and consider any others, that'd be really appreciated. I'll address one question that's come up, which I think is a very important point, and then I'll read out the others for Nigel and the team to provide answers to. I 100% agree that the sort of community-based action and grassroots projects are extremely exciting and extremely important to the energy diversity and sort of security and balance going forwards. I think it's important that we actually take the time to address the points that Nigel's just gone through there with regards to the challenges that we have upon us, and why things have been so difficult to move forward in the past, and actually there's still many of those challenges that we have to overcome going forward. So there's a lot that we're going to propose, and I'll address this in the next section of the webinar. A lot we're going to propose to try and help to stimulate some of that and kickstart some of that community-based action across different scales of projects. But again, it is a challenging landscape that, as the data and the statistics highlight, we haven't been overly successful previously. And actually that brings us on to one of the questions that I'll read out now for a response. But the question that was posed was around community. As we've discussed, community energy is not very popular in Norfolk. This question specifically states that Conservatives at West Norfolk have repeatedly voted down motions to look into this idea. How can any progress be made when some factions are so against looking into new ideas? Nigel, have you got any thoughts on that? I think that the challenges there are as per your previous sort of statements, but I think they're historic in many cases.
Sorry, get the right button. Sorry, Andy, what was the question?
It was just around actually political stance around repeatedly voting down motions to look into new.
Yeah, this is Robert's question from Downham Market.
That's right.
I probably share his frustration. I've been an advocate of community energy for many years. All you can do is provide the levers to those who want to make a difference until some more wide-ranging mandate comes along. So we have to enable, we have to learn, we have to explore what works at the individual location level, and make sure people have the resources to take advantage of that. As we will talk about later, there are still some quite important issues around funding local schemes. And the whole area of green finance, community bonds, is only really just taking off, which is disappointing, but I guess given COP26 is only just behind us, probably not surprising. We are where we are, and we must think harder and try harder to enable people to get on with it, whatever it is.
Thanks, Nigel. I was just looking at the chat there, trying to work out which questions are visible to the audience, whether it's the published or the new questions. So I think we're just going to go through and make sure they're published, and I'll read out the second one for response. Scientists are saying that net zero by 2050 is far too late to keep below the 1.5 degree target. The target is based on unproven at-scale carbon capture technology. The timeline is important to set the scale of work that needs to happen. What is local government in Norfolk doing to reach net zero emissions in our county well before 2050? Again, very open question with regards to what local government are doing. I guess Nigel, I'll let you jump in just a second, but hopefully the extension part of this project will provide some recommendations with regard to what the local districts can do to collaborate and align their targets and their aspirations. But I think at the minute it is a little bit disjointed in individual approaches. Is that your view, Nigel?
Yes, I think that's both a benefit and a disbenefit. You've got to let communities decide what they want to do, and different groups of people will make different decisions. And a very good example of that is, since 2019, we've seen, I think, 4 districts adopt net zero targets, and we have another county-based target, and they're all expressed differently. I think getting too hung up on defined pathways and precise targets, we just need to better understand what is achievable, and that is driven by a whole bunch of local considerations, and we can illustrate that point very well through some of Neve's slides which are coming up. So we need diversity, we need engagement. What we can't do is mandate specific solutions. Government has tried that and not got it right, and it's almost a lot of the projects and programs that it's put a lot of effort into have fallen by the wayside. So we need flexibility, but build knowledge levels. And I fully agree with the question that's been posed. 1.5 degree reduction by 2050 is it is beyond challenging. So we just have to use our skills, resources, but we do need a different mindset so that those in communities, local authorities who have a key role here because they are so influential in place shaping, can make better decisions. And as we go along, we will understand and learn what works better where. Maybe I'm just too pragmatic, but I think a pragmatic approach is the best way of achieving the prize.
Perfect. Thanks, Nigel. There's 3 more questions to cover before we move on, and I'll bring 2 of these are quite similar, and hopefully we'll cover off some of these within the next sections of the presentation. But just to cover them off here, and I'll link them together. There is clearly a focus on supply, but should demand also be taken into account, focusing and linking of community energy with community insulation schemes. And again, yes, that's a very important point which we will cover. But just to also support that as well. It appears that generated energy cannot be exported to others. Then the only way forward is to allow energy to be exported or support generation of energy by an individual for an individual. So I think, again, looking at the supply and demand side of things, which is very much the stance we have taken to ensure we fully understand that balance in relation to the local infrastructure and the challenges, as well as different generation assets. But Nigel, have you got any views on those 2 points around supply, demand and individual use?
I think the whole debate, this is a personal view, obviously it's not an analytical response. I've been in the energy sector a long time, and we've got very excited about technology A over technology B. Government tends to think in terms of big targets, about shiny new technologies. We need all those. The demand side is hugely neglected, and the whole behavioural side needs to be thought about, and that's about information and understanding. You know, we mandated the rollout of smart meters in 2010. We're not even 2/3 of the way there yet, and most people who've got smart meters don't use them, and suppliers don't offer, in the main, 1 or 2 exceptions, smart tariffs. So the whole and as prices get higher, because they ain't going to come off quickly, people are going to be much more focused on how they use power, and that is where we're at, and hopefully we will be able to make better decisions as a consequence. But the demand side is absolutely critical.
Perfect. Thanks, Nigel. One final question from Will. Can we use systems that are already working, such as the Ripple Energy scheme, with some changes for community schemes? So adopting the Ripple Energy model on a more local basis.
We can, if we overcome our very strong bias locally to onshore wind. The Ripple model is very clever. It finances new developments. It gets sleeved by a supplier. It is the market showing it can respond for a particular technology and support community-based funding or mass-based funding of projects. And I think it's a good thing. But there is no discernible appetite I can see in Norfolk for putting up wind turbines. That's something that comes down to the planning guidance and engaging with communities about what works best. There's a more fundamental issue, which is, and I think, I'm not sure if Need's going to show this particular slide, but you know, large parts of Norfolk see land-based renewables routinely constrained off over 20% of annual production on large areas, and that can only be resolved through working with UKPN and working out where things can go. And that's the kind of thing, hopefully, that our geospatial mapping will be able to support. But it comes back to the point I made earlier on. You know, wanting to do it and doing it are 2 very separate things, particularly if you don't think about the physical system.
Perfect. Thanks, Nigel. There's a few more questions come in, but we'll have another couple of pauses through the presentation where we can address those and hopefully some others. I will publish the next set of questions for people to consider as we move forward. But if we could go to the next slide, please, Neve. Perfect, thank you. So what I'm going to take you through now is really a bit more of an overview of our approach and methodology to this project. We've covered off through the previous slide sort of the project brief and the terms of reference and how that's evolved. This slide really just identifies what we considered early on as some of the barriers that we need to consider and look to address, and the different strands of the project along the bottom there that we were going to undertake to go through those. Majority of those all of those haven't changed. They have been added to, so we still will look at funding and expertise and knowledge, costs, especially within the current climate and also in light of the energy security strategy, as well as constraints across the whole network. Also different sites for land use, land ownership, land categorization and things. So we're still covering all of those, but we're actually going a bit more on top of those, which I'll highlight in just a second. So next slide, please, Neve. So this now highlights, and again, we'll put a caveat in that this is an evolving project. So actually these, as you can see from the previous slide, which was our initial approach, this is now actually what our report structure is currently looking like, but we are continuing to evolve this and add to it. So we currently have the 12 chapters, as well as a number of technical appendices that will be included. And I think you can see from sort of those current headings, there's a lot that's going to be covered in there in relation to the current sort of understanding around generation, regulatory regime, routes to market, the sort of knowledge around community energy successes and barriers and challenges, considering that Norfolk emissions baseline, both territorial and consumer emissions. And then we'll go through a number of other sort of iterations and detail around things that we're aware of around our mapping, the work we're going to be doing with Arup, which I'll cover shortly, acknowledgement of other things that have happened. We've already referenced the LEA and LEAP energy systems catapult and other schemes. So there's going to be a whole wealth of information that hopefully will add value and be available to use by all at later stages. Next slide, please, Neve. So this is just an overview of our current timeline, which covers off those particular chapters and our working models. The key date, I guess, on there, or two key dates really, is the lot 2, which is this particular Community Energy Kickstarter project, which we're looking to conclude in and around the middle of August. The lot 2B, as we mentioned, will conclude slightly after that, and we'll cover that later. But the red block on that timeline, right down the bottom right-hand corner, is actually an external conference that we're looking to deliver with the support of NCCP around socialising the findings of this project, as well as the lot 1 project, the shift project, and actually going into a bit more detail around our findings, our analysis, our recommendations to actually proactively move a theoretical feasibility study into a practical action plan for delivery. So again, that's a date. 23rd of September is the date we're planning for that, and we'll make sure that all those that engage and the details we share that date with you. Next slide, please. So we've mentioned previously around our place and people-centric approach, and we've also mentioned our geospatial mapping platform, the Net Zero East mapping platform. We use this really to not only sort of cover the data sets we've mentioned around bays, but all the other ones that we have available to us, to kind of gather that data around key metrics, understanding synergies, but starting to paint a picture around what the data tells us and what the place and locale represents with regards to local appetite, political stance, land use, infrastructure capacity, and sort of the constraints around that. We've also previously mentioned around things, understanding the network and working with UKPN to get a better handle on the active management zones and what that means for new renewable generation capacity and what impacts that will have on future plans. So we fold all that into our thinking, and we'll continue to provide a bit more information on that as we go through the presentation. As we've already mentioned, the Net Zero Decarbonisation Pathfinder was an extension to this project to make sure we consolidate the findings across lot 1 and 2 and come up with a proactive action plan and toolkit that supports the governance and structure of the NCCP to proactively drive community-based action. And I'll cover a bit more on that shortly too. We intend to provide the findings of this report and the technical appendices and some other sort of summarising information that provides a pragmatic guide to future delivery, provides examples and models of different types of projects at different scales that could be successful across the county. And I guess this is, as we're kind of highlighting this, and as we can see from the questions, it's really important that this remains a project that has an open engagement sort of policy to it. Really, we've had a number of conversations with different stakeholders, strategic housing teams, a number of businesses, as well as with the district councils as form part of the NCCP, and we need to continue to build that narrative from supporting groups. So any groups that are available that want to engage, whether it's community groups or specific groups that work within the local authorities that have an invested interest in some of those supply demand side activities that we've kind of discussed through the questions previously. We welcome conversations with all of those. I'll highlight our specific locations in just a second, but actually it's more around the wider knowledge and understanding of what is happening or what the appetite for community-based action is, so we can start to paint that clear picture and narrative. Next slide, please, Niamh. So place-based methodology. So with regards to this project, as I say, we kind of, as we've previously discovered, we've evolved the terms of reference to make sure it isn't restrictive to just considerations around the types of technologies such as solar and behind the meter and private wire applications, but actually taking a much broader scope, but taking that bottom-up regional assessment. In order to do that, we've identified 8 locations that are considered representative locations across Norfolk. We've selected one within each district and also one that allows us to engage and acknowledge and represent the Broads Authority. So those 8 locations, as I say, they're labelled as representative locations because the actual name of the location is, for the purpose of this project, not really relevant, as what we're looking at is the characteristics in relation to those specific locations. It's understanding the characteristics around, as we mentioned before, the local infrastructure, whether that's the electricity or gas networks, the land use, the socio-economics, the deprivation, the fuel poverty. So all of those things that we have at a local level, down at LSOA level, across and also across wards and parishes, that we can use to build that narrative and understanding of what the reasons for potential interventions are, so we can sort of answer that question around why would a project be considered or potentially suitable in these areas. And the reason we're doing that is these are typical sort of representative locations, market towns in many cases, that we feel, given similar characteristics across the county, the types of projects that we identify, for examples, could be lifted and potentially implemented elsewhere if characteristics, etc., are similar. We could also identify areas where we can scale and grow when appropriate, given new generation or constraints being reinforced on the grid, etc. So we're building a good diagonal slice of opportunities. We're starting to build a long list of what these projects could look like in those locations, and we will be carrying out specific analysis across all 8 of those projects. As I say, it's just important to acknowledge that this is a feasibility study at this stage. So, but we are very conscious, hence the evolution of the terms of reference and how the report is going to be structured, to ensure that it doesn't end up just being a theoretical piece of work. There is a real opportunity to turn this study into future scoping studies and future projects that can be delivered on the ground. Next slide, please, Niamh. So Niamh's going to go into a bit more detail in a little while around actually our approach, given our capabilities with our mapping platform. But here's a couple of examples through the graphics of the type of work that our partners Arup will be doing. So as I mentioned, we'll be carrying out analysis across all 8 locations. We will be providing high-level analysis and options assessments down at LSOA level for consideration across all 8, which again will provide sort of a menu of options with regards to projects that could be beneficial in those areas. And those types of projects are going to cover all things from looking at how we can work with the local authorities to aggregate demand based on EPC data, for example, how we can aggregate the opportunity to maximise the eco measures and the LA Flex categories to work with some suppliers to get a bigger impact on the benefits of those types of projects, as well as looking at other things around potential heat, transport and power opportunities at different scales. So whether that's something that works across a business community that looks at sort of large scale solar carports, for example, or even smaller scale projects that work at community level with different types of leisure centres or sports clubs and things. So there'll be a wide, diverse scale of what we do. Working with our project partner Arup, we'll actually intend to deep dive into at least two of those locations. And at present, given the analysis we've carried out, those locations are looking like being North Walsham and Thetford. And we will actually carry out a more specific modelling of those locations. And that will allow us to kind of build on things such as the LEA that take a bigger sort of national data set and kind of slap it over a specific location. So we'll be able to work with that type of data through their modelling tools, but also build our data into that from the ground up to look at the specifics down at LSOA level to really add benefit at a much granular level. And on those two locations, North Walsham and Thetford, we will then start to develop a much bigger narrative and model and looking at supporting business cases around providing opportunities to take it to the next step. As I mentioned before, this is the first stage of the Kickstarter project, but it does require subsequent stages to make sure there is appropriate action to fully scope out, look into more detail where required, build the narrative around how these projects could be successful going forwards. Next slide, please, Neith. So through the project so far, we've been engaging with a challenge group as well as the steering group to kind of better understand actually what the challenges are, what the barriers are, and how we can best position ourselves to overcome those. So I mentioned there around looking at a diagonal slice of different types of projects. And in order to do that, there's a lot of questions that we need to answer and understand. And the first one there really is, and I mentioned this before, was the why. Why would a particular area be of interest to some form of community-based action? And we have the tools to do that. We have our own platform, data and analysis capabilities, as well as working with Arup and with the NCCP and other stakeholders to really drill down into the granular data that's provided that answers the question as to why that type of location would benefit from some form of community-based action. And that's really important, because then once we understand the why, we can then start to identify who would be the right people to initiate those projects. Would it be the local authorities? Would it be a business community? Would it be sort of smaller scale community groups? Who would be those that would have the biggest success or be at the right scale to move those projects forward? And throughout this project, we'll also identify ways that we can support those, clear the wood for the trees around some of the sort of governance and structures that need to be overcome to actually move them in the right direction. Once we've identified the who, we can then kind of look at what types of solutions are most likely to succeed. As I say, would it be something that's in relation to household level, where we can aggregate sort of LA Flex and maximise on the eco measures, working with suppliers? Would it be local authority projects that actually allow decarbonisation activities across their fleet and infrastructure, or other things? So there's different types of projects at different scales that would need to be considered, depending on the location, depending on who's involved. We would then need to consider sort of how these projects would need to be financed and funded, and that's actually still a very challenging area. We've got some case studies that are coming up that will highlight some of those. As we've already discussed, some of those sort of refer back to the FITs and RHI and other things that are sort of no longer available, but those that are still accredited can move forward. But in relation to the how, we identified 3 potential categories, and those are sort of traditional projects. So if we're looking at sort of the traditional household solar, regardless of location or where we are, that's sort of a national thing that really doesn't require much in the way of specifics. The mechanisms are there. We can identify how they would add value to the end user, which would generally be the household. The second category would be sort of bespoke projects, and this is a bit more around the specifics around the characteristics of the location. So this is that place-based, people-centric piece around what does the local infrastructure, what does the local building stock tell us, or what sort of projects could add value that are not run-of-the-mill, but sort of aren't too innovative, aren't too disruptive. But again, specific finance and funding structures would need to be identified to move those forward, as well as, again, identifying the key stakeholders that would need to be involved. The third category is around those sort of innovative projects. We kind of mentioned before around smart local energy systems and other things that actually have a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of things still being understood around what can and can't be done and at what scales. So these types of projects would be quite unique in the way they're funded and financed, and also through the sort of the application and permitting processes to move these forward. So again, more challenging in their makeup. Next slide, please, Steve. We've mentioned a number of times already around the Energy Systems Catapult and the local energy asset representation project. So this is just one of the things that we're kind of sort of aware of, but there are many, and we will obviously make sure we map all of those across so we understand what role they have to play. But I think one of the things that we have to understand, obviously with a sort of a predominantly dispersed county such as Norfolk, is the one-size-fits-all approach is unlikely to be successful. There's many things around the projects that we're aware of that don't really take local planning or local constraints or other things into account when they're proposing what could be a suitable option. So we need to make sure we acknowledge these, continue to research these, and build on those studies as well as delivering what we're doing here. And we feel that our approach complements and adds value to those, and will really provide a good platform to stimulate and kickstart the community-based action going forwards. As we mentioned before, we cover a lot of data, and Neve will sort of go through a bit more of how we use that data and the picture that we build. But as I say, within our current geospatial mapping platform, we do have well in excess of 150 data layers that provide value across all of those in building that narrative and painting that picture around what may or may not be achievable in those certain locations, which gives us the opportunity then to kind of provide those examples based on the particular characteristics. So the longer term objective of turning the report into sort of a suite of resources that will be available going forwards is part of the Lot 2B project, which we'll discuss later. But we need to make sure, as we've mentioned before, that this doesn't just remain a feasibility study that sits on the shelf. We want to support it and hope it gets read and utilised going forwards. But essentially, it needs to be something that's maintained and managed over the sort of short, medium and long term, to ensure we can capture the data that is happening, as well as driving forward those projects that do have the highest chance of success. I think that was me, Neve. Next slide, please. Okay, perfect. So I'll pause there and take breath. I completely forgot to post those questions in as I was talking, but I'll put them on the screen now and allow people to digest those. I can see there's been a number of questions posed and published. Let me just catch up. Bear with me. Okay, one question. So after Will's Ripple questions, we've got one question that's come in. Isn't part of the problem facing Norfolk the lack of an integrated and quantified decarbonisation plan that has a transparent and inclusive governance framework to include both community energy initiatives and commercial as well as local government schemes? At present, there is no apparent connection between what we know should be a decarbonisation target for the county and the host of unconnected initiatives put forward by local authorities.
I have already popped a little answer to that in, Andy.
I can't see that. Apologies. Sorry.
Oh, right. Or it may have gone direct in that case. Basically, my answer is that's why we're doing the study, really. There's a need to, what we're doing here with the Lot 2 feasibility study is, to gather evidence, see what's going on, look at the possibilities, understand the options, and then at the back end of it, we've been asked to develop a framework for developing that kind of climate change plan. And I fully agree with the questioner that we all tend to rush off and do our plans, adopt our targets, and we never really check whether or not they're achievable, and how they, and whether they are consistent with each other. And quite clearly, some aren't, and some places still don't have targets. So, you can't change that. But what we're hoping is that we produce an evidence-rich assessment, and then when we get into doing Lot 2B, we can develop some options and proposals around exactly this kind of explicit framework with governance that can sit over what each of the participating entities are doing. Whether or not that is something that people give priority to, I can't really say. That the county council has its own environmental plan and policies and transport plans. We wrote, as part of a different piece of work, a net zero 2030 strategy and climate action plan for North Norfolk, and their target's 2030. Breckland had already adopted their own policies and they're looking at 2035. Others don't have any. So I think what we're trying to do is at least provide the factual underpinning that will allow people to hopefully come together and adopt a more meaningful framework and strategy for governing this work going forward. But whether or not the participants sign up to it remains to be seen, and that covers as I say, the local government and the LEP and the Broads Authority. It doesn't cover community groups, so we need to make sure that there's also the ability to build engagement at the local level, and that might even be done through the parish councils. So a number of unanswered questions, but we know what the questions are, and we're going to try and give some ideas on what those answers might be.
Perfect. Thanks, Nigel. Apologies, I can't see which ones you've responded to. So the next question was in relation to, we've mentioned it's challenging to sell electricity from community generation schemes. Is there an opportunity to store the generated energy in batteries and then sell through charging stations or similar, for example? Is there a way we can kind of decentralize the generation and storage and supply aspect?
The simple answer is no, at the moment, because as soon as you put anything onto the public system, as it is, batteries are treated as generators if they export. So you still need a contract with a counterparty who would have to be a licensed supplier. So that issue is still there. More positively, however, well, first of all, the costs of batteries had been rapidly falling. They've started to lift again as a result of resource availability, and also the fact that wholesale prices have made a lot more people want them. But you know, particularly in an area that has large constraints, the best thing to do, though it is not something that is affordable for all, and that's a separate issue around equity, is to combine PV, rooftop PV with batteries. Under the old FIT regime, you didn't used to need that because you could de-risk your PV investment and get a guaranteed export tariff. That no longer applies. So, you know, batteries are in a very different position. The market rules are only really just catching up, and there are, you know, issues about, you know, still hard enough for a lot of people thinking about putting up a PV. If you roll in a battery, it can give you a headache, but from a system point of view, it is I think what they call a win-win situation.
Perfect. Thanks, Nigel. A couple more. We've got one from Brenda. Are disinformation and climate denialism significant constraints on community energy projects, in your opinion?
Yeah, I have answered that one. And I basically answered it. I chose not to answer it by saying that's not part of our brief. Matter of fact, the issues that we're addressing and which need to be tackled, whether or not there is a change in wider public sentiment towards climate and climate change, are the ones that we're addressing in the report. Over time, attitudes will change because they will have to change, in my personal view, not part of the work. But it's not helped. But I do actually believe that what's been happening with prices anyway is giving a lot more people a sense of the problems of affordable, sustainable energy supply. So, you know, attitudes are changing and they will continue to change.
Perfect, thank you. Last couple. There's one here around future energy pricing being unpredictable. Have you answered that one, Nigel? Before I did. Perfect. I don't know if the rest of the audience can sort of see your response. I don't know if you want to just quickly summarise your response.
Well, risk management from a local authority or any public corporation's point of view is very, very important. In the past, a lot of it's by no means uniform, but there's a very mixed level of take up by local authorities and investment in renewable sorry, I was just reading a note from Neve. What was the question, Andy? Sorry.
Sorry, it's around the risk management.
Risk management. In the past, there's been a real downside potential, and that has made some local authorities less inclined to invest in renewables unless they can put it on office buildings, have it behind the meter where the avoidable benefit gives them a real return. That is changing with the way prices are moving. Whilst prices are uncertain, the general direction of prices is only going one way over the long run. That doesn't mean we're going to see an increase from 2,800 a household, but at some point they will normalise, dependent on what happens with availability to gas. But the general cost of policies, for instance, the cost of electrifying the networks is going to and decarbonising heat is going to mean that prices are going to tend only to increase over time. So I think what I would call in the industry as the hedging benefit of investment in generation will only increase. The problem is, even if that is a decision that a local authority wants to take, or a community group, you still have the issue of what you do with a surplus or an export. And our legal framework, our regulatory rules, do not really allow us to answer that in a very helpful way at the moment. But it's a debate we need to have, and it's a debate that people like Power for People and E3G and many others are very keen to push up the political agenda.
Perfect. Thanks, Nigel. Last couple and then we'll move on. Thank you, Nicola. Nicola mentioned obviously some challenges felt with the local councils around climate emergencies, and has stated that this work and our report will hopefully support overcoming some of those in moving the districts and the council in the right direction with regards to their declarations. And the final question we'll cover in this section was how do we propose to engage communities in developing the detail of the community-based schemes that we've mentioned? We'll do more webinars like this, and we'll continue to engage with as many stakeholders and representatives as we can. It's pretty much an open door policy with regards to an open phone line policy with regards to who we will have the conversations with, because we need to ensure that actually our thinking aligns with what is what the local appetite is and what the considerations are at ground level, but also with regards to our case studies and the deep dives we'll do across those locations, as we start to further, especially across Thetford and North Walsham, as we start to identify real tangible projects, we will obviously then take the next step of engaging with the key stakeholders and representatives in those particular areas to ensure that they have the correct representation and the greatest chance of proactively being moved towards an actionable project plan, and we'll continue to work with the NCCP to ensure that is a viable route. But as we've kind of experienced through the delivery of our project, actually trying to engage with the right stakeholders and the right representatives is challenging. I think the community group landscape is a challenging one in general. So yeah, we need to do whatever we can to make sure we're getting a decent coverage of our approach and what that means for Norfolk as a whole. Okay, thank you ever so much for all the questions. I'll ensure I pose the third and final set of questions as we go through the next few slides, but we'll now move on to a bit more of an overview around our approach using our data and our platforms, and then moving on to our sort of understanding of the community landscape and some case studies. So I'll hand over to Neve now.
Thank you, Andy. Just get back. Here we are. So I'll quickly introduce myself. My name's Neve Carpenter and I'm the mapping analyst at Net Zero East. So I've been doing a lot of the mapping work for this project in particular, building on all the things that Andy's mentioned, and I'm going to touch upon them again just in a little bit more detail. But first, just wanted to look at Norfolk's territorial emissions. So every year, about mid-year, BEIS publish territorial emissions data at the local authority level. Now, the data published, for example, this year, 2022, coming out kind of end of July, is going to reflect emissions 2 years prior, so it'll be 2020 data. So the data we're using at the minute was published in 2021, but reflects 2019 emissions, just so you're all aware. So this is 2 years looking back almost. So Norfolk's emissions in 2019 stood at 5,761.9 kilotons of carbon dioxide. Put a graph on here to represent the breakdown of this into each local authority, into the 7. You can compare that to the average of Norfolk's local authorities and their kind of average of local authorities across England. So you can see where, who are the high emitters, who are the low emitters, excuse me, and in what sector. So Norfolk had per capita emissions of 6.3 tonnes in 2019. This kind of varies and fluctuates across each of the individual local authorities, but in 2019 the transport sector was the highest emitting sector, and you can try and put this down to different causes, but one of the main things that we like to make people aware of is that transport emissions in our county are obviously going to be quite high due to its rurality. We've got quite a lot of transport. You've got the main A11 and A47 roads, people travelling to the coast, locals, tourists, business travel. So transport sector emissions are typically quite high, and we do expect to see them remaining quite high until the transport sector itself can decarbonise and lower its own emissions. But that's a particular issue that Norfolk does face, and we are very aware of that, and Norfolk is quite individual in that matter of its rurality, and that also kind of creates certain challenges in other sectors that I will touch upon. So moving on from that, this is a nice slide. I think a few of you may be familiar with this slide. It's one of the ways we show the importance of spatial mapping and data analysis through spatial mapping. So as Andy's mentioned earlier today, we collect lots of data from all different sources. We've got BEIS, UKPN, DEFRA, DFT, National Grid, Natural England, all sorts of different sources, and it comes in this kind of jumbled pile, as you can see the Lego blocks in the top picture, all jumbled and mismatched. And often this data is locked away in vast spreadsheets, quite often difficult to navigate, maybe a bit confusing. So what we do, and one of my main jobs at Net Zero East, is firstly to sort this and make it all nice and neat so it can be understood properly by us and by customers, who are often local authorities and key stakeholders. We then arrange this, stack it up nicely and present this data visually through kind of spatial mapping and in visual formats in order for it to be understood a lot better and for this information to be used going forward. And then alongside this, we explain this data and what we have found through our analysis with a story, applying it at the local level to, and for this project, we apply this to each of our 8 representative locations. So it's really this place-based approach that Andy mentioned. It's very people-centric, looking at literally street level data, actual real life data and scenarios and what is happening at the ground level, and then we can apply this to projects such as the Community Energy Kickstarter for a wider benefit that can be applied elsewhere. So as I say, we've got all our data and we present it visually, and this is just a graphic to represent how we look at each sector individually, so we can use land use data, some transport data, emissions, obviously from BEIS. Household efficiency is crucial in this project and to the community energy picture, as well as socio-economics. It's not just about emissions, it's not just about climate change, it's integrating all these different sectors together and putting the people next to the emissions, next to the potential decarbonisation problems, and then creating an overall solution that will benefit all of these different challenges in one go rather than tackling them separately. And then next we have a map here, and this is purely to demonstrate how we take this data in spreadsheets and present it visually on maps such as these. This is Breckland District, so everyone is aware, and we use this map and the data behind it, and we create our story. And you've got some data there on the right hand side of the slide to kind of give you a more in-depth picture of what the map is representing, some of the data behind it, and we have maps for each of the different, I say, sectors that we want to look at. So for example, in this particular project, we have got maps particularly for the gas network and the amount of households connected to it. And we've got the same for electricity. We can see how many households are using oil central heating rather than gas and electric, or even solid fuel. And we can look at all these different aspects through maps, paint a nice picture, and then it can be understood internally, it can be understood by the local authorities, and then you can filter this down, and this can be used at community level by the residents who are actually kind of putting forward their ideas and community initiatives for an overall benefit. Just load in the next slide. There we go. So this is where really we do try and focus on the people-centric approach, and that is by engaging with the local stakeholders. So this is kind of moving away from more of the household level and looking towards businesses and the councils themselves, and kind of identifying the key stakeholders in each location and how they can bring benefit to the project. And by doing this and quite literally mapping it on a map, you can start to identify different clusters where you can try and build up engagement and action that will benefit the wider community as well as those individual businesses, and that's really important for our project, to make sure that there is a kind of community level approach to this. It's not just one business doing it by themselves. We have these clusters, we can identify them, and then we reach out and engage with them to try and build up this kind of togetherness in the community to benefit the community energy scheme. And next I'm going to just pass on to Joanna. She's going to give you a few case study examples of community energy action across the UK.
Yep, thank you, Neve. I'm Joanna Wannat. I'm an analyst at Net Zero East and Hydrogen East, working mostly on policy research. And here I'll just give an overview of the community energy landscape in the UK, and it will also constitute its own chapter in our report. And I think Nigel already touched on a lot of the points, but I'll just recap that. So since its emergence in the UK in the late 1990s, community energy has grown through finding opportunities for smaller scale decentralized energy activities in the UK's highly centralized energy system. And however, the largest single step forward for community energy was the introduction of government revenue payments, such as the feed-in tariff, and the first government price support mechanism aimed specifically at smaller scale renewables. However, subsequent political changes have seen the FIDs and other public policies become much less supportive, and new renewables activities stall. And it is predicted that some renewable activity will continue, but groups are exploring a wide range of activities, partnerships, and business models. And with the removal of subsidies and other financial support, there has been a shift in the sector away from electricity generation projects, with only 8.2 megawatts commissioned in 2020 compared to 15.4 megawatts in 2019. So that's quite a big drop, and organizations are refocusing on a whole system approach, including both their core priorities of tackling fuel poverty and demand reduction, and exploring innovative business models on flexibility, low carbon transport and local supply. And here on the left, on the right, there is the there is the graph highlighting these changes. So that's from the latest 2022 State of the Sector survey, which covers 2020 and reflects these changes. So we also had a look at the case studies to explore business models and governance structures used by existing community energy groups, the opportunities and barriers. And the case studies have been analysed by the UK Energy Research Centre team. Next slide, please, Niamh. So the first one is Edinburgh Community Solar Cooperative, which is a community benefit society. Its objectives are a combination of environmental and social, with a particular focus on reducing emissions, elevating fuel poverty, improving energy security, and promoting sustainable development education. And ECSC settled on renewable power generation as a means of delivering this combination of environmental and social value. And today it operates 1.4 megawatts of solar PV panels on the roofs of 24 council-owned properties in Edinburgh, including schools, leisure centres and community halls. And the building's owner, the City of Edinburgh Council, purchases the electricity, and any excess is sold to the grid. It also raises substantial income through the feed-in tariff, equating to approximately £190,000 per annum. And any surplus revenue is recycled into other local sustainability-related initiatives via its community benefit fund. And in terms of human resources, the board of 11 is made up of 7 volunteers, 3 councillors and 1 Energy for All member. And additional co-opted member is the Energy and Sustainability Manager at Edinburgh Leisure. And the composition points to how ECSC is highly reliant on human resources sourced both from within the community and from its key partners, namely the Council and Energy for All. So ECSC's income is centered on the sale of electricity and the FIT. It sells electricity to the council and to the utility EDF. And roughly 60% of revenue is coming from the FIT, from the generation tariff and the FIT export tariff. And the other 40% of income stems from its PPA for power supply to the council. So yeah, that's just to illustrate that FIT is still quite important for this case study. And in terms of funding and finance, ECSC received a grant from the Scottish Government's Climate Challenge Fund to undertake a feasibility study. And then for the early stage development funding, they were able to secure the Scottish Government's CARES, which only covers 95% of the agreed cost, and meaning that the additional loan from Energy for All was required to pay for grid connections. And now we've got 2 more case studies that are a bit more, they're predominantly FIT dependent and are not relevant anymore in the current system. So I'll just quickly give an overview of them. Niamh, could you, yeah, thank you. So the second case study is Green Energy Mall, which is also a community benefit company. And it owns and operates a 400 kilowatt run-of-the-river hydro scheme on the island of Mull of the west coast of Scotland. And the overriding purpose of GEM is the creation of a revenue stream for investment in long-term transformational sustainable change to the island of Mull and smaller neighbouring islands. And making a positive contribution to the environment is an important but secondary objective. So yeah, it's just in terms of income, its income is based primarily on the sale of electricity and the FIT. It earned almost £440,000 from its PPA with Solarplicity, but this sum was dwarfed by the £191,000 it received from the FIT, which makes 80% of their revenue. And the next slide, please. Gwent Energy was formed to deliver environmental benefit and cost saving to its local community. It aims to help local consumers save money on their energy bills through a combination of renewable energy, efficiency, storage, and electricity vehicle charging interventions. So together, Gwent Energy currently owns 260 kilowatts of energy assets, one 100 kilowatt biomass boiler and 160 kilowatt of solar PV. And it's interesting because it operates as a community interest company, unlike the other case studies, and has relied much less on community shares. Instead, it has operated as an investor club model that includes approximately 40 investors who together have invested around £170,000 into the organization by way of loans and bonds. However, it is still very reliant on price guarantees like the FIT and RHI, which provided with around 40% of its income. Even so, its income streams are diversifying, typified by its move into installing and operating electric vehicle charging points. In terms of human resources, Gwent Energy is driven very heavily by its key founder and director. He is a retired electrical engineer with considerable experience in his field. He contributes over 50 hours per week to the company without taking a wage. He also undertakes installations, is responsible for the bulk of the sales the company makes, and the director also developed the investor club finance model deployed by CIC. But yeah, like I said, these two case studies are not as relevant because they're dependent on FIT. And the next slide, please. So the last case study is Brighton and Hove Energy Services, which primarily focuses, its primary focus was to develop both renewable energy and energy efficiency projects, while also ensuring people have equal access to energy. BHSCo is unlike other community energy case studies in that it operates very much like an energy services company where they accept some degree of responsibility to provide the energy service that its customers ultimately desire, lighting or ambient temperature, rather than the straightforward supply of heat or electricity. BHSCo has relied heavily on community shares. Prior to this, BHSCo relied on small loans, including from its founder. However, it relies relatively little on price guarantee schemes like the FIT and RHI, which accounted for just 5% of its income in 2018-2019. So that's quite interesting for us. Instead, its income is mainly derived from the pay-as-you-save contracts, whereby the customer pays nothing upfront but covers the cost of the measures through the savings they generate, normally over a 10-year period. Although many of these are facilitated by government grants that account for about a third of its income. In terms of human resources, including the CEO, in total BHSCo has 5 members of staff who draw a wage, 3 full-time and 2 part-time. This is unusual in the community energy sector, where much of the work is done by volunteers. And the driving force of the cooperative is its founder and CEO. Her background in finance and energy has meant that she was very well placed to develop the complex pay-as-you-save model on which much of the business is based. She was also prepared to work at BHSCo for 2 years without a wage in order to build the company and also lend the company money. In terms of income, in total, around 50% of the interventions undertaken by the co-op are completed using pay-as-you-save. One potential issue with the model is that it has not been applicable to the fuel poor groups that BHSCo has worked closely with. Although it is BHSCo's intention to finance its activities to combat fuel poverty from profits in the future, currently the delivering for the poorest continues to be dependent on grant funding. The business model is also less easily applicable to those who do not own their own properties. And in terms of funding and finance, the major investment in BHSCo business development has come from community shares. And again, it should be noted that BHSCo has raised share finance in an area with above average levels of disposable income. It is likely that higher than average disposable income has helped BHSCo to raise share capital from the local community versus area with less disposable income to invest. And next slide, please, Neve. So now I'll just quickly summarize all the takeaways that would be interesting for us. So most of the community energy schemes on the generational side are FIT dependent. Ensuring a predictable way to market is also key for the success of new community energy schemes. Government subsidy is the basis to securing both community and private finance. Price guarantees like the feed-in tariff have provided ECSC with a long-term guaranteed revenue stream. So these have in turn de-risked ECSC's renewable energy projects. Their removal has now, however, presented potential future investors with a less attractive proposition, likely closing down an important stream of finance. And that's probably relevant to a lot of these schemes. Local authorities are a key facilitator of community energy projects. For example, in the case of Edinburgh Community Solar Cooperative Project, the local council purchased the power generated from solar PV and also provided the building roof space to enable this power to be generated. The latter is highly dependent on the extent to which the procurement process and council leadership values locally supplied low carbon energy from not-for-profit organizations. And the ability to raise community finance is dependent on the affluence and population density of locality, like I've said on the case study number 4. And partnership with public landowners are critical to project delivery. For example, Forestry and Land Scotland made land available for use by the GEM project to site their hydro scheme. And without this, the project could not have taken place. Energy efficiency and heating services can constitute a core offering of community groups. So unlike many other community organizations, BHSCOS has been able to develop a compelling value proposition centered on delivering affordable comfort and warmth through a combination of efficiency and generation measures. By employing a pay-as-you-save model, it has unlocked a previously untapped revenue stream for communities, which importantly is less reliant on generation subsidies such as FIT. However, we find the model is limited in its ability to assist the fuel poor, who cannot be expected to share any cost savings generated, and tenants of rented properties where landlords are uninterested in investing in energy savings. And choices around legal structure have an important bearing on the financing and governance of a community energy organization. So yeah, that's everything from me. Thank you.
Thank you. Joanna.
Yes, thank you, Joanna. Thanks, Neve. We've had a number of questions come in, which I will work through now. Some of them very much acknowledging the same key takeaways as Joanna just highlighted there. Thank you very much to the person who provided a nice response to the question, what are your thoughts on the main barriers to successful implementation of community-based energy projects across Norfolk? That's a nice lengthy response, which we'll certainly work through. So just to start up on the ones that we haven't covered yet. Okay, so this is an interesting one. Welcome your thoughts on this, Nigel. From Will, can the problem in West Norfolk, and this I guess this was in relation to sort of the political stance and some of the perceived barriers. Can the problem in West Norfolk be solved by the community acting without the political system being included? What's the viability of that approach?
Limited. As a pragmatist, I would suggest you've got to build consensus, not least ultimately any wind scheme or major infrastructure development is going to have to go through the planning process, and that has both political and bureaucratic dimensions. I remember the debate that was taking place in the run-up to the publication of the government's energy security strategy, where, you know, it started off, it was like an open negotiation between Tory MPs through the media, where it started off saying we're going to lift the limitations, the planning limitations on onshore wind, and the whole thing got diluted at the end to something where there had to be a very strong local advocate and there was also some qualification around other stakeholder support, which I take it means the local political leaders and the council. So it's very, very difficult. I wish it was more straightforward. But I'm not personally expecting to see any real change on that. We had the chance to revisit the baseline earlier this year, and we nudged it in one direction, but didn't really reach a firm landing. That's my personal view.
Cheers, thank you, Nigel. Thank you, Nicola. We'll definitely take you up on your offer to introduce us to the relevant groups that you've mentioned there and key stakeholders. So thank you for that. There's one sort of comment here around how telling is it that 3 of the case study examples are from other home nations, and the only English one is from Brighton and Hove, who have the only Green MP. Just to put a sort of caveat against that, we are obviously including lots of other case studies. Those ones were sort of selected around the financing funding aspects, just to highlight some of the challenges and barriers. But Nigel, I didn't know if you wanted to just quickly touch on some of those other case studies we've reviewed and considering.
Yeah, well, I think it's a very good way of giving people tangible examples. And even though one element of the arrangements may have changed, there are other elements which are very relevant to our study, but as you rightly say, Andy, the funding side, the whole choices around community benefit and other governance structures, which are very important. So we're going to continue to develop that. You're absolutely right that the Scottish and Welsh governments have been a lot more focused on having some form of community energy strategy, particularly in Scotland. But I think all schemes now and planned schemes are beginning to feel the impact of a removal of the revenue support mechanism. There was an interesting study I was reading recently that said from a sample of 100 schemes, just over 100 schemes across GB, 90% were viable before other breaks were included, and that had fallen to 20% with the removal of FITs. Mind you, that study was done 2 years ago, and of course wholesale prices have changed dramatically since. So it's very hard to reach hard and fast conclusions. I personally would like to see more thought given to including community schemes in the emerging flexibility markets that electricity distributors are developing. Personally, I would like to see the basis for allocating things like losses, thermal losses, revisited, but there is no regulatory appetite for that. So we are where we are, and we need to reflect the current baseline in the modelling we do in support of the study. So that's my answer to that.
Thanks, Nigel. I'm conscious we're into our last 9 minutes, and I'll just take sort of address this this final question at this stage. This one comes from Jan. It says, reference emissions. There is a benefit to large commercial enterprises producing renewable energy and selling it to either local businesses, e.g. retail business parks, or local residents, e.g. district schemes, which helps them to reduce their carbon footprint at the same time. is the study looking at such similar schemes? I think the easiest answer to that is yes, we are looking at those types of schemes and we are looking at those integrated models. But I think, as we've sort of highlighted a couple of times or a number of times through this presentation, is there are a number of challenges around what could be generated and supplied and in what ways. So I think there's a number of challenges to overcome and how we actually look at those private wire PPA applications in the different examples that we're going to cover. Nigel, I don't know if you wanted to add to that just before we move on.
No, it's a good example of how things are changing. I mean, back around 2015, there were levy exemption certificates as well as subsidy payments, and those have all been unwound. What we call in the industry embedded benefits have been taken away by the regulator. There are new instruments that are meant to recognise and incentivise green purchase by corporates, REGOs being the main one. Ultimately, if we begin to lag against the stated objective in the energy security strategy of completely decarbonising the electricity system by 2035, I hope we have the dexterity in policy terms to think of other ways that some of the what I see as barriers to local renewable take-up, how those can be removed. But we're not there yet.
Perfect. Thanks, Nigel. Very conscious now we've got just over 5 minutes to go and 4 slides to cover. So you're still in the hot seat, so I'll ask Neve to move on and we'll cover off these final few slides.
Yeah, all this does is it's an early stage slide we did looking at what we thought were some of the options in 6 key areas. In fact, since then we've developed a long list based on our 8 representative towns of what we think might work in those places, and in the cases of certainly Thetford and North Walsham, Arup will be modelling that to see what they, what lessons they can derive. But there, as I said right at the beginning, that the definition of decarbonisation, net zero action, community-based energy engagement is very, very broad, and it's going to require a little bit of discipline to put a clear framework around it. But I think we're doing the work, and I think we're making good progress. But we are deliberately trying to adopt a very inclusive approach, looking at a variety of demand side and transport related elements as well as conventional generation. So we think that local systems different, they'll create different opportunities, but those opportunities are many and varied. Next slide, Neve. So that's really just a landing point on where we've got to. The study's progressing. We're broadly happy with some of the progress. We are very keen to engage with regional stakeholders, people in councils, people actively involved in the community space. We don't know people we don't know, so please spread the word. Our slides will be up on our website by the end of today, and please do feel able to share them with as many people as you think would be interested. So that's a landing on what we've done. During the course of the study, and Andy noted this at the beginning, we've been asked to do what we call Lot 2B, which is really to think about how some of the findings that we come up with, and also we will need to have the work from Ricardo in front of us as well, might be turned into a template for a more enduring governance structure that sits around what our NCCP colleagues call the Net Zero Decarbonisation Pathfinder. We will not be writing, certainly as this part, in this part of the work, the Pathfinder, but it will be around process, governance, options, targets, in the hope that we can bring all the relevant stakeholders together and agree what that common position across the county might be. I know a couple of people in the question box have flagged that as being something that's missing. We need to do our work first before we reach a landing on that work, and that will be slightly lagged at the end of the project, but we're effectively approaching the work package in the round, and our main report will anticipate the Pathfinder and the direction of some of our thinking. So that's the Pathfinder document. The last two slides from memory simply set out no, it doesn't. The core elements of the Lot 2B work, the Pathfinder work, but to do that, as I've just said, we will need to also set out clearly in our report not just this regional assessment, which has been lacking, our statement of the fundamental barriers, and also how that can segue into the Pathfinder process. We've talked about case studies. That is important in understanding what works in other places, though some elements have changed, particularly with the withdrawal of FITs, but other things have changed in a positive direction. Increase of concern around local resilience, for instance, higher wholesale prices. And what we will be doing is having a section that begins to scope out what we call toolkits, but what we think is the best information and resources available, and where people can find them, so that you can take forward your own assessment processes going forward. So last slide, please, Joanna.
That's it.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
I think we took a slide out that shouldn't have been taken out, and we left one in that should have. My apologies.
Yeah. Perfect. Thanks, Nigel. Thanks, Joanna. Thanks, Niamh. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for the last 2 hours, and thank you very much for all of your questions. Sorry for those that we haven't got round to answering within the time we've had, but we have your details, and we will look to answer those questions and continue to engage with you going forwards. And again, thank you to those that have offered to provide additional introductions to key stakeholder groups across the different areas that we're identifying. So thank you very much, and hope everybody has a lovely long weekend.
Indeed. Thank you very much, team. Thanks for listening, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.